Hello and welcome to Why Is This Happening with me, your host, Chris Hayes. You know, I spend basically most waking moments these days thinking about how to put the fire out that threatens to consume American democracy. But when I'm not doing that, occasionally, Kate and I have been talking about this a lot, like at night when we're both home trying to sort of sort through what's happening. I'm finding myself trying to think about, like, well, the house is already so burned that even if we put the fire out, we're going to have to rebuild it, basically. Like, the amount of damage that's been done means that the sort of constitutional order, the way things are, the way things were, status quo, ante, there's not going back to that. There's something on the other side of this if we survive it. And I've been thinking a lot about, like, well, what do I want that to look like? What if you think about this moment of break? If we can survive it, if we can get through, if we can preserve American democracy on the other side as an opportunity to build something new. And that is a more fun, both bewildering exercise and more enjoyable exercise than the constant thrum of emergency, even though the constant thrum of emergency is really important because we can only get to the rebuilding phase if we don't let them destroy this completely and then just like build their own, dictatorial prison over what used to be the house. And I was thinking about that as I was reading this great new book that you probably have heard of because it has been very central to discourse. It's called Abundance. It's by my very, very good friend Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson. And they've been on book tour and talking about it a lot. But what it is, the book is way more than I thought it would be. And I thought it would be great. But it is, in some ways, this kind of invitation to think generatively about what kind of world we want to build. And that's an exercise we don't think about a lot, and particularly in the defense of Crouch right now, but it seems to me more important than ever to think about it because hopefully we're going to get to that point and then we're going to have to be ready to do something else. And so it's really, really great to be able to welcome the co-author of Abundance, Ezra Klein, to the program.
I'm so glad to be here, an object of the discourse.
You are really an object
Live
of the discourse.
On the other side of the camera.
I spent a little time being the object of the discourse when Siren's Call came out, and I've been watching you and thinking about it is a strange experience. Well, let's do something meta to start. Let's talk about book tour. What's strange about it is that what I found strange, and particularly in the beginning part, is you write the book so that the book exists. Because what you do is you talk and write columns. You have a podcast, the Ezra Klein Show on New York Times. I do this podcast and TV show. But a book is its own thing. It's a text. And when you're doing the first part of the book tour, you're just distilling it into sound bites. And there's something a little frustrating because you're like, you want people to read it because it took a lot of work to write.
Derek sometimes says that the product of the book is the conversation. Mm-hmm. That's really what you're creating. I'll say I'm having a very different experience on this one than I had on my first book, Why We're Polarized. Why We're Polarized, what I felt like happened is I wrote a book, I promoted the book a bit, and then the book went off and had its own life. Like I sent it to college,
right,
and it had its own experiences. And every once in a while I would check in and be like, how you doing? Like, what are you learning? And this book, it has detonated into the discourse. People had very, very strong opinions of it before reading it, which I want to say I'm not complaining about. I think that is part of how this goes when it goes well.
Yeah.
And then there is this argument that it kind of helped create or helped concretize that then I am part of or a symbol in or trying to help shape or trying to decide how to participate in. And that's been very different. It's been like the feeling when I used to surf a little bit and bodyboard a bit when I was younger, like the feeling when a wave catches you and now you're both like trying not to fall off, but you are taken by a power beyond your own. Whereas like the first book, I just watched the wave go.
Yes. And that's, and there's something enjoyable about that. There's something enjoyable about that, right? I mean, we all want our ideas to get a hearing, and 99 times out of 100, they don't get a ton of hearing, or they do. I mean, the way the news cycle works is it moves so quickly that it's just so rare that anything feels like it sticks.
I don't know what I thought would happen, but for all the reasons you said in the introduction, in a moment of as almost unfathomable peril as this one, when the news is as overwhelmed as it is, my expectations for how much the idea of abundance could break through were smaller. And so I've done a lot of reflecting on why has it broken through the way it has? Why has it set out this argument? And one, I think there are a couple of reasons, but one of the big ones, maybe the biggest, is I think for Democrats or the non-Trump coalition, whatever you want to call it, I think the stakes, which have always been high, now have really clarified that if you don't make liberal democracy work, you really might lose liberal democracy. And I think this is a difference between Trump's first term and his second. That in his first term, his impulses were dangerous, but his capacity to carry them out was clearly impeded, weak. He was distractible. He was surrounded by people who did not want him to destroy the foundations of American government. And so until maybe January 20th, for all that he did many things that I find terrible in the first term, and he mismanaged the pandemic terribly, and all the things we know, he was quite overmatched by the system. And in the second term, he isn't.
Yeah.
In the second term, he is overmatching the system. And so the threat that many of us felt he posed, but didn't quite come into view until the very end of the first term, is now very real. And in the sense that if you can't make this government deliver, running it in a, and I don't mean here liberal in the American tradition, but in the broader tradition, as a liberal democracy, you might lose it to the strong men who come in and promise that they're rich, they're powerful, they're connected, they're not going to listen to anybody, and they're the ones who can make it deliver.
And that they can get things done. And this is a theme that runs throughout Abundance that has been really top of mind for me, and I think it's a good place to start, which is process fetishism, procedural fetishism, liberalism as currently constituted being very obsessed with process, and Trump being the opposite of that. I mean, he's the anti-process figure. Talk a little bit about the relationship that current version of liberalism has to process and what that means.
I've been trying to think about, because it comes up a lot, the right way to describe this. And the right way to describe what I hear from the people who are inside government trying to carry all this out. And I think it is fair to say, I believe it to be true at this point, that the output of the system is the process, not the outcome. Mm-hmm. The system is designed to follow the process, not achieve the objective. And that is why so often in different bills, the objective is ultimately not achieved. I spend time in the book on California high-speed rail. We could talk about the dreams of the Second Avenue subway or the Big Dig. We could talk about rural broadband under Joe Biden or the electric vehicle charging network. It is not that it doesn't achieve anything. Sometimes it achieves it slowly and over budget, and sometimes, particularly when it's just moving money around, it actually is able to achieve it. When we expand the child tax credit, we actually do send people checks. But when the project is building real things in the real world, the way the system is now set up, inside the system, the dangerous thing is not to fail to achieve your objective. The dangerous thing is that you fail to follow the process, and an inspector general or someone else is going to haul you in front of them or release a finding, or you'll be pulled in front of Congress and yelled at. And you can't say, no, I was just following the rules. And then, yes, in some sick way, it's like that system summoned its opposite. And not just Donald Trump and Elon Musk, who are happy to burn the entire process down, who are functionally lawless, and are now creating a kind of government in which no rules need to be followed. And the infractions have overwhelmed the system that polices them, right? In a system where everybody is following the rules, to not follow the rules is quite dangerous because you might get caught, you might get yelled at. In a system where nobody is following the rules, where the inspector generals have been fired, where the courts are overloaded, where nobody can enforce how many infractions are happening, then it becomes not dangerous really at all to be one of the people following the rules. I mean, it's a difference between breaking into a shop on the street on a calm day and participating in a riot.
Right. So there's two ways that I'm processing this exact thing. And I think this is kind of the core right now. Because in some ways, to take your first point, right? Process as fairness as opposed to outcomes is the core of the rule of law, right? What makes a fair trial isn't whether the person is found guilty or found innocent. What makes a fair trial is the process under which that enterprise is conducted, right? So there is something deep in a kind of legalistic sense of process as fairness independent of outcomes. But there's also something perverse about it when you don't like actually build the charging stations or you don't build the subway.
Can we hold on the first one? Because that really was interesting for me. Because I think you're right? And this is a big point of Bagley's paper, that within liberal legalism and within legalism broadly, the way government legitimacy is achieved is through following process. But I want to hold on what you said. Because imagine you did have a court system, and in many cases we have had this court system, where it does follow the process. But then imagine it turned out that 50% of the people we could later find, the studies were done, information came to light, whatever, that they were wrongly convicted or wrongly exonerated. So at some point you have this reality.
Right.
That on the one hand, the system is following the process, right? The thing we said made it legitimate. In any individual case, because we know, tragically, the courts will sometimes get things wrong. Like the question of whether the trial is fair is actually different than the question of whether the trial found, quote unquote, the right outcome,
right.
the true outcome. But if you began to find that the error rate was huge, that it was missing the right outcome, the fair outcome, 40, 50, 60% of the time, well, then I think you would have to say, oh no, we've made a mistake.
Yes.
That this process should not be deemed legitimating. This process is failing. And I think this is a very helpful analogy because it's really the argument we're making in the book. The argument we're making in the book is the process has stopped achieving the outcomes we want. In fact, it is routinely impeding the outcomes the process was ultimately supposed to be a neutral arbiter of. In the environmental arena, being able to lay down infrastructure that is good for the environment. In the housing arena, being able to make housing affordable in big cities. I just spoke to somebody who is essentially quite importantly responsible for the Biden Rural Broadband Initiative, which has been a kind of example I've been using on the tour, which Elon Musk tweeted out the criticisms I was making of it when I talked to Jon Stewart. And he was telling me that he would estimate that he spent 40 to 50% of his time doing internal government process. It wasn't really about solving the very difficult problems of rural broadband. It was about just responding to the system's demand for constant response procedure, checking in, meetings, interagency, that 40 to 50% of his time, right? So at some point you have to say, okay, that is not the process succeeding.
No, and you have a line in the book, and I'm not going to pull up to quote it exactly, but basically you say something that really struck with me, which is the people closest to this are often the people who complain about it the most and see it most clearly. Mm-hmm. Like we had Jeremy Konondyke on, who was at USAID, very recently under Biden, and he's like, "Look, you want to hear about the flaws, bureaucracy, and problems and red tape of USAID, buddy? Like I could do that all day, okay?" One of the points he made, interestingly, was like a lot of that came from congressional micromanagement, ironically enough. So, added layers of process and accountability. But it really is the case. You talk to people in the VA, right? People in the VA who spend their lives trying to get veterans health care. And the VA is actually quite a functional bureaucracy, I think, as bureaucracies go in many ways. They'll tell you all the things that are terrible about it or frustrating or all the red tape they have to do. But the sort of twin instincts I have watching this happen with Trump and Doge is a little bit of jealousy, which is like, God, it would be nice to have some fewer lawyers in the Obama administration. God bless the lawyers in the Obama administration, including my wife, who would have asked for forgiveness instead of permission on stuff and just moved more quickly and not been so process obsessed. So that's one instinct I have, right? The other, though, is, oh, wow, all this stuff that feels like red tape and process is pretty GD important because this is what it looks like when you get rid of it. And I'm wondering, like, how you're calibrating that exact sort of scale of reaction.
I love that you admitted both of those, because I think it's something that I'm hearing privately from a lot of Democrats, but they don't want to say publicly, that there is a kind of envy. What if we could have just?
100%.
And there will be something that needs to be learned here. I do think the really important word there, though, is calibration. I don't think it ever gets to be as easy as government is good or government is bad, or regulation is good or regulation is bad, or process is good or process is bad.
Right.
You have to be outcome focused. And in any individual case, you have to be smart about that. The problem is we've developed in liberal governance a culture that has become, as I said, process and not outcome focused. So the other thing that you said that I think is really important, and I have heard from so many liberal, very, very liberal civil servants, right? The people we have charged with the difficult job of achieving the world that we have voted for.
Yep.
And what they say to me again and again is, I wish I could just act. And if I did something wrong, and it turns out the way I did it wrong was not serving the people, that then you can hold me accountable. You can fire me, you can prosecute me if I broke the law. But this prudential process,
that's interesting.
This extraordinary, as somebody put it, edifice of process to make sure nothing goes wrong in the first place. And on the back end, to make sure I'm endlessly audited and overseen and producing reports on how I'm spending every dollar. I talked to a woman named Heidi Marston, who was the head of the sort of agency that works on homelessness in Los Angeles. And something she said to me, she had resigned and written a letter about basically the impossibility of the job. She said, look, I had about $1 billion. And if you had let me spend it, I could have done a lot of good. But in reality, that $1 billion had endless little earmarks in it. It had been, micromanaged by various Congresses that had passed into tax credits, be it the federal level or the state level. It had audits, and then they worked with nonprofits, and the nonprofits had to be audited. And it was all just spiraling, and so much of it was understandable if you pulled any one of them out.
This is the thing.
Once in a while, you can pull one out, and it looks stupid. I can give you an example of demanding that the Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation comes up with a workforce development plan to increase the percentage of women in the local construction force.
Right.
Even if that's a good idea, it's probably not the
expertise
them
doing it?
Of the Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation. But a lot of them are fine. And you might say, oh yeah, we want these audits. We don't want taxpayer money spent badly, and so on and so forth. But collectively, it is, Derek Thompson, my colleague, has this good line on this in the scientific area, where he says, it is like we have given the entire bureaucracy chronic fatigue syndrome.
Yeah.
Right? We have taken 40 to 50% of their energy and wiped out its productive function.
Part of this,
and it's not good.
Yeah, no. So part of this, I want to stay on this because I think about, there's a sort of interesting personality dispositional question, and then there's these sort of systems questions of risk. So there's this incident I think about a lot when I think about regulation, which was, I was working out in Prospect Park once with a TRX, which you throw over a tree. And I was just trying to get reps in, and it was a beautiful spring day. And it was
my visual is increasingly vivid. I like this.
it was a very sturdy tree. I was not going to pull this tree down, and I wasn't going to pull the branches down. I know I could. And a parks employee drove up in a car and was like, you can't do that. That's not allowed. And I had this feeling, my general feeling, at a very deep personal level, is I hate rules, I hate meetings, I don't love authority, I don't like being told what to do. I do not have a very bureaucratic personality. I rather ask for forgiveness than permission. That's my general drive dispositionally. And I was annoyed. I was like, what the hell? And then I thought, how many trees are there in the New York City park system? Hundreds of thousands. If you just let people hang stuff off trees, they would bring down branches, right? I know in this individual case, this risk is fine. But if you had to create a rule, should we let people hang things off branches for the entire park system? The rule would be no, because you can't trust people's individual judgment necessarily. And so the difference between individual judgments of risk and system-wide risk ends up being this thing you run against time and time and time again. Yes, maybe one of the Doge backpack boys is correct about what the downside risk is of ripping out some code. But over the entirety of the system, of the payment system, or the defense software system, like those individual judgments might be wrong a lot. And so what you get instead of individual judgment is process, basically.
I think that's right. One way to say what we've done here is instead of giving discretion and freedom of action,
that's exactly it,
to civil servants, bureaucrats, people with expertise, we've given it to Elon Musk and Doge.
Right.
And that isn't what I wanted to do.
No,
what I say
right.
in the book and what I believe now is I supported civil service reform 6 months ago, and I support them now. What I want to do is I want to make it easier to hire, easier to fire, and easier for people in that organization to manage and act.
Yeah.
And I want to do all of that, not because I don't trust the civil service, but precisely because I do. Look, I've had Jen Paulk on my show talking about this, but I was just talking to somebody else about it, again, who's working on rural broadband. The way we hire in the federal government is absolutely insane.
It's totally nuts.
Absolutely insane. People with domain expertise are reliant on the HR functionaries, sending them these lists of who is like qualified based on self-assessment and keyword searches. And they'll go back and they'll say, no. These people are unqualified. This person who applied is qualified. And they'll be told, no, like based on the criteria set out and the thing written, that's not correct. And then you can fight, and sometimes you can win the fight, but it takes a lot out of you. And this is, I want to say it so clearly because one interpretation I keep seeing of the book, which I think is really facile and wrong, is that this book is anti-government and pro-deregulation.
No, it's the opposite in some ways. I think
and the book in some ways is actually pro-deregulation in certain areas, though other
Right.
areas would need more regulation. But it's largely saying we should deregulate the government.
Well, but
and
here,
because it's
yes.
pro-government and we need to trust the government
Right.
more so it can act and then we can judge it more effectively, as opposed to enwrapping it in prudential process as an alternative to trust, which then makes it very hard for outcomes to be achieved, which then makes it very hard for us to judge, are the people that are doing a good job or are they good people in a bad system?
Yeah, and as an alternative to trust, I think is a key part of this, a key part of the story. And you guys quote actually at length, I think, is it Paul Sabins is the name of
Paul Sabin in his great book, Public Citizen.
Yeah, his book Public Citizens, which is about basically the kind of Nader raiders, but it's about the ideological tendency of sort of government skepticism from the left, litigation as means of restraint, and then this sort of prudential legal risk aversion as the kind of background context for all bureaucratic functioning that came out of that. And how that, what's interesting there is what he does really well in that book, and you guys, do a great job of framing this as well, is that it's actually like it's government skepticism. It's government as the bad guy that is the kind of animating force behind so much of that movement and so much about what brings about the results of that litigation that ends up hamstringing government.
I have so many thoughts on this, and I'm so glad you brought this up. So, where do I want to start? So, I think you could think of a lot of liberalism as a sort of contest internally between the New Deal liberals and the New Left liberals. Mm-hmm. And I think that's kind of understood. The New Deal liberals were much more about building things really fast and spending government money and making a big government. And, you have the Tennessee Valley Authority and they're electrifying things. And they're going too far. And it gets enwrapped with corporations and big unions. And there's a feeling that government is doing too much in ways that are harming the environment, which is true.
Yeah.
You have Robert Moses building highways. building a lot of things, but building highways through Black communities. You have a lot of abuses in this era of very torrid growth. And so you have this sort of new left emerge. And it has a lot of arguments, many of them very good. But one of the things it is actually doing is restraining government. When Ralph Nader runs in 2000 and is asked what makes him qualified to be president, he says, I don't think any human being alive has sued more government agencies than I have. Which is interesting as a way of thinking about what he was really doing. It's an interesting answer
to that specific question.
Okay, that's one way of saying it. Let me offer another, because I don't offer this one in the book, so let's go a bit beyond the book. I keep seeing my friends on the left say, this is just warmed over neoliberalism. I think it's worth talking about neoliberalism for a second, because basically everything that Derek and I are targeting here emerges in the era of politics we understand as neoliberalism.
Right.
Like 1970 to 2010, let's call it.
Right.
And Francis Fukuyama has this great line where he says, neoliberalism is not the veneration of the market, but the denigration of the state. The new left is neoliberal, no less than Ronald Reagan is neoliberal. The point of a political order like that is that both sides accept fundamental premises. And what neoliberalism fundamentally is suspicious of the state and venerating, if it is of anybody, of the individual. And so there's a Republican version of it, which is, outsource everything, contract everything,
Privatize.
private markets, privatize, and a liberal version of it, a Democratic version of it, which is more about individual participatory government, a deep skepticism of the state, allowing individuals and groups in the civil sector to sue the government left and right. All these things that get built up that are suspicious of state power and not very suspicious of the motivations that individuals and nonprofit groups will have in challenging state power. And this is all neoliberalism.
Yeah. I mean,
and so I think this is very poorly understood by Democrats and liberals, because they don't realize the contribution they made to this. They see what Ronald Reagan did, but not what they did.
Yes, and the key of this sort of skeptical posture towards government, right, is a kind of really important through line here. And one of the things you see as a result of the sort of Naders Raiders public interest litigation, which you guys do a good job of saying, is like they have enormous successes, enormous amounts of air pollution. I mean, shocking amounts of air pollution is in the air, and it's reduced by 80%. There is a ton of stuff that our cars get way safer because they get sued, and because of all this stuff, that there's a cumulative effect, which is both solving a problem and creating a new one. And what I think the thing that's important to kind of end up in here, which I would like to hear you talk about, is I think some people who are getting the book refracted through interviews can see it as an attack on bureaucracy as such, as opposed to the specific form of bureaucracy we in the U.S. have on the other side of the kinds of neoliberalism from the left and the right that made the government we have, which is actually a different kind of bureaucracy than other bureaucracies. Bureaucracy is constant across the world. It exists in all kinds of governments. All kinds of governments have to do things like build subways or figure out how much housing to put in Tokyo or Los Angeles. But there are better and worse versions and better and worse orientations to bureaucracies. And one of the critiques of the book, as I understand it, is that there are specific pathologies to our bureaucracies right now that are not inherent to bureaucracy writ large and can actually be changed to make better versions of bureaucracy.
Yes. I wish we had a word that wasn't bureaucracy.
Yeah,
because we've so poisoned that word.
Totally.
What I want is extremely high-performing government institutions. I don't like that either, because it sounds like I just fired up a McKinsey LLM.
Right.
But we almost need a different term, because so much of the language here has become poison. Deregulation. I find the word deregulation makes the liberal mind shut down. We don't deregulate. Right. That's what the Republicans do. Well, why? Yeah. Look, if you're Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez has a public housing bill. Compared to some other people, she wants to solve more of the housing crisis through public housing. And the only way to do that, because we've made it functionally illegal for the federal government to build public housing, is to deregulate the federal government, to allow it to do these things. And when it does them, it needs to pay people and build in a way that is affordable and actually gets the job done. Because if you pass a big public housing bill, but you don't have rules or internal capacity, thus for the effective construction of public housing affordably and on time, then your bill is going to be a big failure, right? If you do the Green New Deal, as Bernie Sanders wanted to do it, but you don't have rules that allow you to build green infrastructure or lay down transmission lines to get the energy you're generating from solar and wind power to the places people need it, then your bill is going to be a failure. One thing I like about abundance and the set of arguments we're making here is I think they usefully scramble our political categories. I think they focus us on different questions. I always say that this whole book is really about this very simple line, which is, what do we need more of, and how do we get it?
Right.
And I am not that concerned with what the means are there. I am open to a very wide variety of means. I'm open to market actors and state actors. I'm open to regulation and deregulation. I'm open to spending money. I'm open to taxation, right? There's, like, if you convince me that the way to get more clean energy or more affordable housing is one of these, if that's what will open up the supply choke point, that's important to me. But what I will say, there are 5 chapters in this book, and the third is called Govern. We have an entire chapter on state capacity, an entire chapter saying that in order to have the world we want, one of the things we need more of is effective government, strong enough to achieve the outcomes it promises. And one way I think this scrambles people's political intuitions is a lot of people who I think understand themselves as emotionally pro-government actually are not. Mm-hmm. They are, in practice, extremely suspicious of the government.
Yes.
And they are much more trusting of interest groups and coalitions and outside watchdogs than they are of the government itself. And many of these people believe they are to my left, but not that necessarily this matters, but I believe I'm to their left.
Right.
Because what I want is a government strong enough to build high-speed rail as it can in Europe, or Japan, or for that matter, China. What I want is a government capable of building public housing as it does in Singapore. But what that will mean doing is breaking arrangements that Democrats and state machines and liberal organizations have become very comfortable with and in fact quite rely on. And that's a problem where you get more attached to the structure of your coalition and the politics that don't create internal dissension than to the things you have promised the public.
Yeah, and you see this. I mean, if you've ever covered a fight over building anything as a local reporter, like you see this, and sometimes it has a left-wing valence and sometimes it has a right-wing valence. You know what I mean? Like, so like I've covered fights where like the lefties in the neighborhood didn't want the Borders bookstore to come in because it was a chain bookstore, but it was also part of a development that would have had some affordable housing, but they were going to go after the Borders bookstore, but then that was going to take down the math of the whole project. So the whole thing that never got built. And I've covered people who have rallied to make sure that a homeless shelter or an SRO for women didn't get built in the neighborhood. And sometimes the same people, but this sort of, when you're in one of those meetings, there's an interesting thing happening about like what the right and the left is in the room, which is almost meaningless. And you will get people who I think of themselves as very liberal saying insanely reactionary things without realizing they are saying insanely reactionary things.
It's really tough. I mean, I'm in California right now. I've been here for about a week doing media hits and events, but also much of this book is rooted in California. I'm a Californian. I wrote a lot of it living in Oakland and San Francisco, which are highly dysfunctional from the question of what do we have, what do we need, and how do we get more of it. The week I'm here, there are really big reform bills of the California Environmental Quality Act that have been unveiled. And the California Environmental Quality Act is a sort of relative of the National Environmental Policy Act. And the way these big bills work, and they're very, very important bills, is that if you are building something, and in California, not just state, but anything that requires permitting, which is everything, you have to consider the environmental, and that is extraordinarily broadly defined, consequences of that build. And these used to be very short, and now they're very long. The National Environmental Policy Act, it can take, on average, 3.5 to 4.5 years to complete an environmental review, right? It's longer than it took to build the Empire State Building to just create the review. And I'm trying to think, because it's a big deal here, well, how do I want to see this bill reformed? Right? Because in Berkeley, for instance, somebody used CEQA to sue against the expansion of dormitories at the University of Berkeley because the addition of students is bad for the environment. They create trash, they create noise, they create traffic. So when you're there, you're in a bad place, right? I would say that person is very, that's a reactionary position in my view. Okay. Here's a thing that I think is very uncomfortable for liberals, and it is uncomfortable for me. One of the big interest groups that fights reform of CEQA, and CEQA has become a real problem for building housing, for clean energy, high-speed rail. They began doing the permitting, the environmental permitting in 2012. By the end of 2024, they were almost done, more than 12 years. The unions defend CEQA here aggressively. And the reason they do it is that CEQA is leverage.
Right.
They are not trying to protect wetlands. What they're using this environmental bill to do is say, look, developer, if you don't make this a union project, if you don't make this pay prevailing wage, we are going to use our lawyers to tie you up in so many CEQA challenges, you will wish you had never started this development in the first place.
Right.
Now, I am like broadly pro-union. I don't think that is a good way to do union power.
Yeah.
I think we should have environmental bills that protect the environment and have clear, that have discernment in them, right? That what they do is not just sort of process, and if you show you've done enough process, you don't get sued, but actually what they do is orient our development in pro-environmental directions. And I think we should have bills that empower unions in important ways. But I don't think the environmental bill should be procedural leverage on basically everything else, right? And it's not just the unions. Rick Caruso, this big developer in LA,
well, that's the thing,
for
right?
mayor.
Yeah.
So it's everybody in LA.
Right.
He's using it to stop somebody from building something near his mall. It's just become leverage that everybody uses on everybody else. And my view is that's bad. We have just created a procedural weapon that is not, like my joke in all this is make environmental policy protect the environment again, right? That's what I want it to do. I don't want it to do all these other things, even if sometimes it's helping out a constituency that I'm broadly sympathetic to.
But part of this, though, this was the one thought I had through the book, was like, there was a period of time where I was going to write a history of the New York City subway system, and I read a bunch of the...
Dude, I want you to write a history of the New York City subway system.
It would be a fun book. So there are two things that happen when I read, there's like 6 or 7, broadly, books in this genre, and I basically have read all of them. And 2 things came about. One was that, one of the things that's clear is at any time under any set of rules, building something big is an enormously complicated bit of politics. So like you can't remove coalitional politics, interest group politics. Like this is difficult stuff. There's some developer, he doesn't want to sell, and then there's some neighborhood that has some, politically important group that are connected to the mayor. So you can't. So all this stuff is just building. Like that doesn't go away. And then the other thing that did strike me when I read these subway books is like dozens of people died. I mean, it is shocking how many lives were martyred to build the subway. And they built it fast, dude. Like it was cut and cover. They went through stuff. But it was unbelievably dangerous. And like, that's the other part of it is that, and you guys get to this a little bit, but how much of it is the specifics of some dysfunction of us or California, and how much of it is just like, and you wrestle with this a bit, but I'd like you to talk about it, the accumulated reality of essentially an affluent society. Like, yeah, it's harder to build the 2nd Avenue subway in the 21st century than it was to do cut and cover on the streets in 19th century with Irish immigrants literally dying by the dozen. It's like, yeah, guess what? It's a lot harder. There's a lot more stuff. We value life a lot more.
I think this is where having a lot of comparative examples in modernity helps ground your intuition somewhere sensible. Because look, I also don't want dozens of lives martyred to the 2nd Avenue subway.
Right.
And so I'd ask everybody, is your impression of France or Spain that they do not value human life? Right? Is your impression of France or Spain, which are quite good at building subways and are better at doing it in places like Paris, and you can't tell me that Paris doesn't have a lot of old and important stuff in it than we are in building in New York City or across California, like, have they gotten, with their much cheaper, much more capable subway construction, have they gotten it wrong? And we, who can no longer build subways, have gotten it right. Because I think there's sometimes this tendency to say, well, you have to throw everything overboard.
Right.
But you don't have to throw everything
Right.
overboard. You have to choose what it is you're saving.
Right.
Or
but-
you don't get anything done.
Yes, but the only thing I would say to that, and I think you're totally right, like these comparisons are important. I'd say two things. One is the comparison of Spain and France is much better than the comparison of China, which people love to do, because it's just like China's just in a different part of its development trajectory. It has a different political system. They're not a democracy. Like, I have sailed down the Three Gorges Dam and talked to my Chinese Communist Party minder about how many people lived in there. And he's like, oh, we think about 100,000. And I was like, oh, really? What'd you do? It's like, well, we just moved them all. I was like, okay, right. Yes, this is a different thing. But the second thing I would say about that is that it really does come back to when you talk about Europe's particularly. Tom Gagan, the great labor writer, once had this essay book that he wrote. And his insight, which totally tracks with stuff in abundance, is that we replaced regulation with litigation. That like we have a litigation society where risk is managed by litigation. And Europeans say this all the time. They come here and they're like, the fact you have to sign something when you have to go in some kid's amusement park they think is nuts. Like, they do not have the culture of litigation there. What they have is a culture of regulation and a kind of empowered civil service. Our very American, and you guys say this in the book, we don't trust government. So we sort of outsource this all to litigation. And that is a huge part of why, when you look at these European countries, they're able to do stuff we aren't able to do.
And litigation is slow. This
Yes.
is such an important thing
Yes.
about it. It doesn't always get you the right answer, right?
No.
The idea that going and challenging quickly before a civil servant with expertise is less likely to give you a good answer or a good outcome than going and challenging slowly over years before a judge who knows nothing about this project at
Yes.
all is actually quite weird. But what the other thing does is it is more leverage for the challenger, right? Because delay is very expensive, delay is very potent, and so the possibility of delay can be wielded much more effectively. I think the question you asked 2 questions ago is so important because, how do I want to say this? I think we have to be very clear about the trade-offs we're making and have to make, and the trade-offs we don't have to make.
Yes,
but are
that's a
making
good
anyway.
distinction. That's a good distinction.
And I find there's this kind of King's Cup that will happen.
Yes,
right?
with both of them, right, yeah.
The things that are good stand in for the things that are bad. I keep having this come up on, I'm in California, I'm doing these events, and people keep saying, well, this is really a problem of human nature. How do we persuade people to support a multifamily affordable housing development down the block or a multifamily apartment complex down the block? And what I keep saying to them is, you don't.
Yeah, just take away their ability to block it.
The reason Houston and Austin build
Yeah.
housing and LA and San Francisco and Boston don't isn't that we got rid of selfishness in Texas.
Right.
Like, we did not change,
Right.
reshape the quality of the human soul in Texas. But like that technology, that soul reshaping technology to make to California, we changed the default, and it is your God-given right to complain about an apartment complex going up down the block. And frankly, it should also be your democratically given right to like send a letter before it happens to your city council member, like making
Right.
your concerns known. What it should not be is your procedurally granted right to delay or destroy it.
Right.
That should happen at a higher level with the people we've elected, who can then be judged over time in a more coherent way by the whole community, seeing the outcomes of different projects. And having made all this, litigation and procedure is the wrong balance. I'm sure you've run into this. There's an interesting thing happening right now where Democratic governors across the country get very excited about these rebuilds they're doing under emergency declarations. So the I-95 bridge falls in Philadelphia. Judge Shapiro is able to rebuild it in 12 days. There's a version of this with Les Moore in Maryland. Gavin Newsom, when I went on his podcast, which was a fascinating experience.
I saw.
It's like, you should have talked about the I-10 here. We did that in 10 days. And it's like, if you're all so proud, and everybody else is actually excited too, about what you're being able to get done under these emergency rules that wipe away a lot of process. But by the way, the I-95 rebuild, that was still done with union labor. Then what does it say about your normal rules? And this goes to a really important insight of Bagley, where he says, liberal legalism, which is at this point just liberalism, because between Walter Mondale and Tim Walz, every single person we named to a national ticket had gone to law school. Liberalism has convinced itself that what legitimates government action is process. But for most people,
yes,
what legitimates government action is outcomes. And it is what it did in their lives. And I agree that you could have outcomes, you can imagine the benevolent dictator gets you outcomes with that process. But usually that actually doesn't happen, and we're not, for instance, I don't think Elon Musk and Donald Trump are going to give you good outcomes doing what they're doing, right? It's bad process, bad outcomes. But the actual, I think, provocation that Bagley, who is himself an administrative procedures lawyer, who is Gretchen Whitmer's lead counsel, I'm not quoting Milton Friedman's disciple here. His insight is that government seems less and less legitimate to people because it works less and less well and achieves its outcomes for them less and less often. And that is actually reducing their support for even the kinds of procedures that we need to keep it legitimate, right? We are just ended up in a dysfunctional cycle.
Right. And this is why, so that I love the emergency. If I can declare the state of emergency, then I can get things built, is precisely the kind of vicious cycle that gives you kind of Trump and Trumpism as reaction, right? And this is why Mitch McConnell it gave us Trump in many ways, I think, because to the extent you break the legislative body's ability to produce outcomes, the extent you sort of mire down processes and they become ineffectual and people lose trust in them, they don't like them, then it's like, well, let's do the emergency thing. Let's do the strongman thing. It just becomes more and more tempting. And so what you end up is a polarized choice between the kind of morass of bureaucracy and here's Doge coming, riding in on its white horse. Although I will say the American people don't seem to be buying that, thank goodness. I actually think they're wildly, wildly, wildly overplaying their hand politically. But it is interesting to hear those governors sing the praises of the emergency declaration, because that is really how you get into the permanent state of emergency, which is really the problem and the place that we're headed. We can't get anything done in our sort of bogged down procedural liberalism. We need a permanent state of emergency where you rule by decree.
And this gets to something that is a genuine trade-off and a very reasonable argument, which is, well, look, aren't you happy you have all these protections, which aren't working that well, but still, now, right? Kyrsten Sinema going around, retweeting everybody who wants to filibuster anything Donald Trump does. Well, aren't you glad you kept the filibuster now? Right. Aren't you glad you have adversarial legalism now that you're turning to the courts to stop Donald Trump? Aren't you glad you had all these things now? And one thing is, they're not working. It turns out a lot of things we treated as rules or laws were norms.
Right.
And the administration get away with destroying them. And I would say the much more dangerous version of the Trump administration is the one that is procedurally arsonistic in the way it currently is, but was macroeconomically competent, right? If they were not using executive authority to lay down insane tariffs that was sending the stock market into turmoil, this would be much more dangerous. But you can't always assume that your strongmen are going to have an insane view of global trade, right? That's not, or even that they will maintain an insane view of global trade if the pain gets too big. So I do want to note that. But the other thing is that we are so afraid of harm that we have made it too hard for the government and institutions like Congress to create progress.
Yeah.
And the reason I think that that's meaningful, and I've always had this argument with people about the filibuster, which I do not support, the reason I think that's meaningful is that the healthiest way for politics to have a feedback loop is for the side with good ideas to be able to implement those ideas and then sell the American people on them. And for the other side to be afraid of harming those good ideas and for them to back off of doing it. And when you break that ability to execute, then I guess it's good that there's some curbs in theory on the other side.
In theory, yeah, right.
But you let the other side in, right? We let Donald Trump back into power. And I'm not saying it's all because we were not able to deliver the things people wanted, but it's not completely unrelated to the fact that pretty over a very long period of time, in blue areas, we failed completely on cost of living. And I think you have to be a more self-confident movement than that. If you believe people would like the fruits of liberal governance, then you have to make liberal governance possible. If you think they won't, well then yeah, it makes sense to be completely defensive about this. But I am more worried about the inability of the people who believe what I believe to change the world in a way that makes people want that vision executed than I am about the others. I think that that is what marginalizes the power of the other side, that you are successful. And I think we've a little bit, we give lip service to that vision of politics, but if you look at how Democrats govern in states and nationally, they don't actually believe it.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that to me is just inarguable is that housing is too expensive in democratically controlled areas. Full stop. And that the last 20 or 30 years approach of subsidizing the costs that are the central essentials of life is a failed policy mechanism. But then there's like the hard stuff of innovation. You do this sort of thought experiment about going to bed closing your eyes in like 1890 and waking them in 1920. I forget what the 30-year span is, but it's just insane the amount of physical transformation that happens in some of these periods. And then 1990 to 2020, like the internet and computers go bonkers. But, you know, cars, planes, all that stuff is all basically physically the same. So there's this real question about like the frontiers of physical innovation. And right now there's something happening with energy to me that's sort of the most exciting story and is yet gets 1/100th, I would say, the attention of AI. And I'm curious why you think this is. I've been thinking about this a lot. Why is it the fact that we are on a trajectory to maybe to get to like zero marginal cost energy pretty soon? And people don't talk about that, and they all talk about when we're going to get artificial generalized intelligence.
I think this is a great point. One is I don't think people have caught up to how fast the technological innovation, by the way, induced by government.
Yes, totally. 100%.
Super important, right?
Yes.
We have made a better world possible because the government pumped, you know, here in Germany and China, elsewhere, a huge amount of money into subsidizing solar, wind, and battery technology and manufacturing. We've moved up the manufacturing curve and innovated on it, and it's remarkable, and we've destroyed all expectations of what were possible here. But okay. There's advanced geothermal now we're exploring, right? You know, we can do a lot more with nuclear. One reason I think there's not excitement about it is I think we have yoked it to an unexciting goal. One move this book is trying to make is to say that the goal of our energy policy should not be decarbonization, as hard as decarbonization is. The goal of energy policy is clean energy abundance.
Yes.
And so I actually don't think it's that exciting of a goal to tell people, listen, if we work really, really hard, you can have what you have now, and these harms that are mostly abstract to you and described in the future, we believe are going to be largely mitigated. Yeah. Right? Like that's like, good. Like we should do it.
As bad, basically. I mean, that's the other thing that's so hard about it because, you know, there's so much that's already in the pipeline of warming. So it's like also like it's still going to go up, but it won't be catastrophic. Like it's tough.
And there's a big look like inside the broad left, the left broadly construed. I don't mean, you know, the left of liberalism here. There's like a big degrowth, you know, conservationist dimension that is skeptical of that kind of world. But I think the goal is energy abundance. And we talk about why in the book, but I think the goal that liberalism should embrace is clean energy abundance. There's a version here, by the way, where Donald Trump did something like this and did all of the above energy abundance, but he actually then didn't. He is trying to unleash fossil fuel investment and construction and usage, but he's also trying to destroy wind and solar industries, like in the same breath, right? So now you have actually two quite contrasting visions, like a world built on more dirty fuels that encase us in a heat trap and coat our lungs with particulates, or like this amazing world of like solar punk and wind and nuclear, and it's really possible. But it is energy is a form of wealth, and we should treat it as such. We should want, on the left, as liberals, I want people to be richer. I want them to have more things that are wonderful for them. I want them to have good lives. I want the world to have energetic wealth so things become possible in the future that are not possible today. There are a lot of problems you can only solve that way. And this is one of the, the book is operating on a lot of levels, but one of the levels is kind of like ideological vibes, I would almost call it. I think the relationship between, liberals or Democrats or something and technology has become dysfunctional. And because of how dystopic specifically social media became, even as it enriched like 6 white guy billionaires, everybody kind of soured. Like the sort of relationship began to sour. And so then even as this remarkable story was happening in energy, we weren't really telling it. Totally. Although we were funding it. I mean, one of the tragedies, I think, of Joe Biden's age made his capacity to communicate and tell his own story much diminished compared to what it would have been if the Joe Biden at who we knew when he was 65 was a very different political figure. Innovation was so central to this administration's agenda. The infrastructure bill, the Chips and Science bill, and the Inflation Reduction Act, these were all, particularly the latter two, at their core about technology. These were bills about green infrastructure. These are bills about advanced hydrogen. And these are bills funding all kinds of things to create the energies of the future and the transmission networks necessary to get that energy everywhere. And Biden could kind of still make an argument about building, but he was just, there's no other way to say this. He was much too diminished to make the argument that was actually true about his policies, which is that he was actually reorienting the Democratic Party's agenda around innovation. And building the artifacts that innovation could create, the sort of embodied manifestations of that innovation. I think that's a really important politics. I think when you lose the future, you begin to lose. I think Barack Obama represented the future and he won. I think Bill Clinton represented the future and he won. I think in a weird way with Elon Musk on his side, Donald Trump began to represent the future and he won. I think you want to take back a vision of the future. Look, I think AI is a really big deal. I covered a lot. I think it is, in the near term, people will feel it in their lives in a way they're not going to feel an energy transition. In the long term, it's actually not clear to me that AI, we'll have to see what happens with whether or not the scaling laws top out, before we get to sort of superintelligence, or AGI. But I don't know. I'm a person who believes AI is going to be truly transformational. And so I don't want to pit them against each other. But I do want to say that in both these cases, it should be at the center of politics how to both manage and shape these transitions. I'm always saying this to people. I would like to see the federal government shape the kinds of AI systems that are developed by shaping the incentives to develop them. So having prizes for solving huge scientific and technological and pharmaceutical problems. And then you get $1 billion if you built an AI system like AlphaFold, which predicts the 3D folding of proteins.
Right.
You get $1 billion or $5 billion if you solve a problem that is worth that much to us, and we get the answer.
Right.
Right. That molecule is generic from the get-go. Right. There are different ways to do this in the ways we have done it. Instead, it's like AI for national security, which maybe is necessary, but is dystopic in a million different ways. And then it's AI yoked to subscription revenue and maybe advertising.
Right.
Like that is as big as we can think, and then we're trying to regulate some harms on the margin. Like that's not good enough. Try to change the world. Like imagine a better world and use the government's unfathomable resources to get us there faster.
Well, this point about I'm so interested in this. I've been thinking a lot about this, the sort of left's relationship to technology, which I do think there is a very, and a totally, I want to be clear on this, a totally understandable, like strong kind of neo-Luddite stream. There's this book, Blood in the Machine, that's sort of like a celebrating the history of the actual Luddites by Brian Merchant, which is a really interesting book. There's this feeling that like the aesthetics of AI slop is fascist adjacent, which is not a crazy idea. Like it really is right now being used to like literally generate fascist memes for the White House. There is this relationship that's grown extremely skeptical. And I totally understand why. Like there's a lot of reasons for it. At the same time, yeah, you got to own the future. And the green, like the carbon-free, green, boundless energy transition that's happening, which truly every chart blows your mind more than the last chart. For me, as someone who covered this for 20 years and it was like, we're screwed, there's no way out. To see that there is a way out now. Like there's a path out. There really, truly is a technological path to zero emissions. That wasn't true 10 years ago. And it wasn't true 20 years ago. It wasn't true 30 years ago. And the fact that like the only, like Dave Roberts' great Substack and podcast, which covers it every week, is like the only place where this has any kind of cultural cachet, but AI is everywhere. Love it, hate it, whatever. It's so fascinating to me almost at like an aesthetic level that, and partly it's just like energy's weird, utilities are weird, all that stuff's like a little remote and obscure, whereas like ChatGPT's there and it's talking to you and maybe flirting with you. But like, but there just is something dysfunctional right now in the general orientation of technology when it is the fact that like technology truly is our way out. Bill McKibben, who you quote, like the people who've been working on this the longest, the most diehard climate people will tell you this. Everyone to a person will tell you, like, that's our way out right now, and we've got it. And the question of whether we deploy it at scale is the existential question of our time.
But I want to pull out of the passive voice here a little bit, right? Because did Kamala Harris run this campaign?
No.
Or did she talk about how much they increase oil and gas production?
Correct. Yep.
Right? Did Joe Biden run this campaign in 2020? No. Right? Did Hillary Clinton run this campaign in 2016? Also no.
No, yeah.
There is a reason.
Yeah, totally.
We're not talking about this. I mean, I do think that the AI comparison is tough because you're not going to get into a emotionally supportive relationship with an mRNA vaccine. You know, like there's something weirder happening there that is so, you know, I mean, it's more like the internet, and we did talk about the internet a lot because things are just woven into the moment-to-moment fabric of what we're looking at. I mean, AI also, to the point of your great book, is an attentional technology in its current form.
Yes, right.
Right, and it's just hijacking our attention.
Yes.
I think there's a lot to be said there.
Totally.
But we get to choose what politics is about. And you certainly get to, at the top levels of politics, try to make it about some things and not others. And I want to keep coming back to this because liberals have been, I think, somewhat divided on technology. And I don't mean technology itself. I mean their affective relationship to it. I think it has become hard for them and to sort of make the argument you're making. The biggest story in the world, the biggest story in politics should be the success of green energy.
Yeah.
Right. Or certainly one of the five.
One of the biggest stories. It's one of the biggest stories
trying to excel. Like it is really, really meaningful how fast that goes. And how fast that goes, and I want to say this really clearly, is in our power. But even Democrats are not doing the things they need to do to make it go fast enough. If you look at where the IRA's money for installation and advanced green infrastructure and energy manufacturing is going, it is going to red states disproportionately because it is easier to build and lay cable and lie down solar panels, including in red states where the politics are against renewable energy, as in Texas increasingly is, whereas in a lot of blue states, it's just very hard to get anything done. And while the Biden administration was very excited to spend a bunch of money on this, they got very nervous when it came to doing the permitting reform necessary to make it much easier and faster to build the things they were funding. And they kind of hid behind Joe Manchin's legs on this one and let Joe Manchin be the guy carrying the permitting reform fight. And then the progressive left hates him for many quite understandable reasons.
Right. And
permitting reform died. But there was never the Biden administration permitting reform push, right? Where they were like, listen, we did this. In order to make it successful, we need to do this other thing. They did do it, by the way, on some things, on chips and science, on the semiconductor side.
They did lean into
it. They
100%.
ended up passing a bill later on that was co-sponsored by Mark Kelly and Ted Cruz that was about exempting the chips and the semiconductor fabs from environmental review. And I should say Mark Kelly just brought out, I haven't read it yet myself, but a new permitting reform package. But it's, I think, really important that we're serious about this because you can't get to that world fast enough if you don't make it easier to build things. You should not be able to challenge all these pro-environmental projects using environmental review in the way you can now. There should be a speedway for clean energy, right? We should we should give it a lower level of scrutiny than building a fossil fuel plant. The fact that NEPA, National Environmental Policy Act, or for that matter, the Endangered Species Act, the fact that they cannot distinguish between laying down solar panels to help save the climate we have and building an oil refinery to destroy it, that is a huge indictment of the bill's applicability to the modern world. not its applicability to 1970 when Richard Nixon passed it, or 1971 or whatever it was, but the applicability to the world we are in now. Like, it is our job to write legislation that reflects the environmental challenges we have. It's not Ralph Nader and Richard Nixon's job to write legislation for the environmental problems we have. And I just think that I really feel this is important, that this is part of how you renew liberalism. Like, the Trump administration does not just have a shitty vision of process. It has a terrible vision of the future. It's a bad future, even if they succeeded, right? A future of less trade, a future of less immigration, a future of less government capacity.
Of McKinley, the McKinley administration.
A future where tons of things are devolved to Trump's cronies and to Elon Musk. It is always such a tell to me that the countries they lionize kind of suck, right? Like, they all love Hungary.
Yeah.
Hungary's not great. If you were going to be a country in Europe, you wouldn't choose Hungary. Right? He's impressed with what Vladimir Putin can do, impressed with what Xi can do. Like, it is really telling about their cramped and narrow vision of the future that the countries they seem to be excited about as potential models are not countries you would want to move to from here. That creates a big opportunity for liberalism in this period of reformatting and reformulation to say, no, we actually have a great vision of the future, not a vision of sacrifice and endless process and like an interagency review stamping on a human face forever. Like, we have a vision of more. And that is an old thread. I was saying, I was bringing up like the New Deal versus like the New Left. But I mean, you go back into old Marxism, the left is actually very much about material abundance.
Yes.
And then it has a sort of another left that emerged that is much more skeptical of it. But I don't think we should have omnidirectional abundance. I'm not saying build more things that are terrible for the environment and so on, but there are a lot of problems you can only solve if you can solve them technologically and you can create, say, clean energy abundance. We are not going to decarbonize if we can't make clean cement. And like, I will just tell you this as a vegetarian who cares about animal suffering, like the least popular part of my politics. If you do not figure out a way to make lab-grown meat, if we can't make meat on a scaffold in a brewery, as seems possible but is very difficult, we will never solve or get anywhere near solving biodiversity and deforestation, because that is actually not driven by climate. That is driven by cutting down trees and rainforest for livestock. A huge amount, like an actually unfathomable amount of the land human beings use is not used for living in cities. We use like 2% of the land for cities. It is because we use most of the habitable land, or about half of it, on Earth for agriculture. And we use most of that for cows, sheep, and goats. Yeah. And if you could replace that, which you will only do by giving people an alternative, you're not going to convince them to move on to like legumes. If you could replace that, then you could do something about that. But if you can't, and instead China's just going to want more and more meat, and Russia, if it gets richer again, is going to want more and more meat, and Bangladesh is going to want more and more meat, then on that set of interlinked environmental problems, we are screwed. So sometimes you really do need the moonshot technological approach. It's not on everything. We know how to build apartment buildings. But I would like to see a government that puts technological innovation to solve our hardest problems much more at the center of the agenda, and much more yoked to a vision of the way that both abundance in the things we need most, the essentials, but also the pulling forward of technologies from the future into the present, as something like Operation Warp Speed did, that should be central to progressivism, because like that is one way we make a world unimaginably better than the one we currently inhabit.
Ezra Klein is the host of the Ezra Klein Show podcast. He's a columnist for the New York Times opinion section, and he's author, along with Derek Thompson, of the new bestseller, Abundance. That was awesome, Ezra. Thank you so much. I know you've been very busy. I appreciate you taking time.
Chris, I always love talking to you. It's always so generative for me, so thank you.
Thanks for watching Why Is This Happening? The Chris Hayes podcast on YouTube. New episodes come out every Tuesday. Subscribe to the MSNBC channel so you don't miss a conversation. For more from me, visit the All In with Chris Hayes YouTube page and follow me on social media at Chris L. Hayes.